Kia ora koutou katoa. Welcome to the Hoon, where co-host Peter Bale and I go around the week's news in geopolitics and Aotearoa's political economy, with a whole bunch of experts, academics and politicians, all to understand our worlds better and have some fun. Tēnā koutou katoa. Welcome in, everyone. I'm Bernard Hickey, co-host of The Hoon on the Kaka with Peter Bale, our fellow co-host in Hoon Bay. How are you, Peter?
Bernard, you're actually over from the island.
Yes. No, I've found myself a quiet little spot in the city with a big juicy broadband connection, some lights, and got myself a little microphone, and have microphone can travel. So
excellent.
It's been good.
And Bernard, we were talking about books today. I was just thinking about the island. Have you read Janet Frame's To the Island?
I have, a long time ago. It's something I need to reread.
I was just thinking it would be worth reading, really worth reading again, actually.
I need to restart reading. I'm one of these people who's prone to ADHD, and my brain has been fried by lots of headlines and too much Twitter and various other things, and I struggle a bit to read through a book start to finish. But
when you say you've got ADHD, my family used to say that I had OCDC. Which would actually be the name for if I had a pub band, it would possibly be called OCDC. And I think maybe I've said before that one of my current survival methods, given the Trump thing, because I think I'm actually not feeling very well. I've been ill for about 7 days, and I think it's some sort of weird combination of depression and Trump derangement syndrome. And so one of my tactics is
You're probably not the only one, Peter.
Yeah, I know. But one of my tactics is to read more. And I may actually show this book twice, actually, because I know Robert will be really interested in it. And I think, did I show you the one about Monte Cassino, which was about 4 inches thick? Very good by James Holland.
I do want to read it.
Well, but today's one, which I'm now 350 pages into.
Well done.
Is Judgment of Tokyo, which is about the Tokyo war crimes trials, after which actually did follow Nuremberg, and it is absolutely extraordinary. The detail. I mean, it is nearly 1,000 pages. The detail and also the understanding. Like if anybody, I mean, I think we're going to talk about books a little bit in our session on the 19th, the end of the year, but. If anybody's read East-West Street by Philippe Sands, the human rights lawyer in the UK, it's a wonderful book about the competing visions of what crimes against human rights were, and the concept of genocide, which genocide wasn't actually considered a crime or understood as a crime at Nuremberg trials, but crimes against humanity were, and genocide came in later. But the combination of the Philippe Sands book and this makes me want to stop my dramatic media career as a co-host of The Hoon and somehow go to do international human rights law. I think I might be dead by the time I qualified, though. But
well, there's a great need for it.
There is a great need for it.
And one of the interesting, second careers for journalists is as investigators of these sorts of war crimes. And I know a couple of people who've gone off to do that.
Yeah.
And I know one particularly good journalist, television journalist, who was an investigative journalist, who then went on to work for the abuse and care inquiry, and fantastic work done there in documenting and telling the story of what went on. That's one of the great roles.
Yeah, I guess the reason I might mention it later when we have Robert Patman on was because. One of the things that interests me is, of course, it was the Nuremberg trials and the trials in Tokyo that really laid the groundwork for how we think, much of the groundwork for how we think about international law and the laws of war now. And things like why did there's a reason the Japanese called the Manchuria incident as opposed to war in Manchuria, was because it allowed them to ignore all existing attitudes to war crimes. But we'll talk about that when Robert comes on, maybe.
Yeah.
What have we got today? And then we'll talk a little bit about the 19th, shall we?
Yes. So first up, as we often do, we have Catherine Dyer on to talk about climate news. There's plenty there. I had some fun this week interviewing or throwing questions during a press conference at Simon Watts. Then we'll have Robert on to talk about the extraordinary events in Syria, no doubt, and in the rest of the world. And then towards the end of the show, Peter, you and I, as practitioners and veterans of the media business, we'll have a chat about a big report that's come out today.
Yep.
On
and a few things have happened as well, and I've got some thoughts about that. So we'll talk bollocks at the end of the show. Have you got a soliloquy today?
I think I have.
Do you?
Yes. On the issue of ferries.
Are you thinking would I am be one?
Well, we'll see. Certainly, it's been one of those weeks where the intensity of the political clashes in Wellington has been right up there, and the polls coming through for the government are not particularly attractive. And I think after this week, Christopher Luxon and Nicola Willis will be grateful for a break, I think.
Yes.
And it will be interesting to see how we all come back after summer. Often the government will get a boost after summer, but I'll have a soliloquy towards the end about the year that was. About the year that was for this government.
Very David Frost.
Yeah.
This is the week that was.
Yeah. Because next week is our last episode of The Hoon, and it's going to be a special one.
Well, see, normally you only tell me about 11 minutes before the one we're doing that you're knackered and that you're going to burst a gasket if we do another one. So I thought I'd preempt that and suggest that next week be the last one. And I hope you don't burst a gasket before then.
No, because I don't think we should do one on the 26th.
I don't know. Boxing Day. But or we could show all our presents. We could do some unboxing, as it were. On unboxing day. No, but Christmas Day is unboxing day, of course. I digress, which is something I'm bad at. So for the 19th episode, I've organised Helen Clark to come in. And the reason I thought Helen would be good is that our audience seems to really enjoy her perspective. She also finds, as we know, the Hoon a hoot. Yes. And, she's a good egg. So far, we have Helen Clark. And I also have invited Josie Pagani, who's a friend of yours, but who, I've always found, both attractive in every sense, in the sense that she's so zany and funny and interesting, and she will come on as well. And if the audience would like, and Robert will be there, of course, Professor Patman, and
Catherine, we hope too.
Catherine, we hope too. Yeah. If she hasn't sunk under the seas, and it'd be lovely if the audience told me, because as you know, I'm the only one who looks at the bloody YouTube thing. If anybody wants to make any suggestions of people we've had over the past year or so who you'd like to see back, we might try and squeeze somebody in. I've been trying to get Halajaba again, but she's slightly preoccupied, and we'll probably deal with some of those preoccupations, including Syria, when we get to Robert. Catherine, do you want to take over on the environment?
Yes, it'd be great. It's great that Catherine's here this week, because it's been a big week.
Always great when Catherine's here.
Oh, exactly. It's a big week for the climate for a bunch of reasons. Firstly, we had some key appointments at the Climate Commission and also the Energy and Electricity Conservation Authority, ECA. Tell us about those appointments and what the government's, the direction the government seems to be taking those two agencies.
Yeah, that's been quite interesting. I mean, the headline for the Climate Change Commission was obviously Dame Patsy Reddy, which I haven't spotted too many people having a problem with so far, but there were also two new commissioners appointed. So we've got James Renwick and Catherine Lining leaving. So those are both people with a lot of academic expert knowledge around climate change, physical as well as policy end of things, and they're both researchers in those areas, and they've been replaced with people with industry background in forestry and mining. So that's obviously a move towards basically allowing industry to have more of a say over the direction of our climate change target setting. And then at the Electricity Authority, we've got a fossil fuel lobbyist has been put onto the Energy Conservation Authority.
I'm soon to be followed by a tobacco lobbyist at NZ Health, I imagine.
Well, yeah. I mean, this is how government is captured. Now, you could,
Yeah.
those people from the other side of politics will say, well, everyone does it. You know, they always put their mates into these roles. Otherwise, you'd never get anything done. The bureaucrats would just get in your way. But, you know, we don't have many protections against the system being abused or going in the wrong direction. We do not have a second house. We don't have a Senate. We don't have a constitution. We don't have rules that block what we call revolving door appointments. So people who were in business go into the government, back out again. We have very little reporting of how lobbyists and industry players connect with government. There are very few rules against, for example, huge donations from some people to political parties. And we heard in Parliament this week some quite strong comments protected under parliamentary privilege by Irina Williams, the Labor MP, who accused Winton Capital, which has donated to the National Party, of essentially buying influence in the government. Now, again, those comments are...
Chris Meehan, I saw him washing his Bentley the other day, and said to him when I then saw him in a restaurant in Jervois Road, Chris, I thought that was so dignified and charming that you were washing your own Bentley.
Yeah, well, he's a man of the people, it seems.
Yes, exactly.
And so he will have listened to the comments from Irina Williams in Parliament, and she's right. The fast track bill that's going through this week, it puts all sorts of projects on there and it rams them through to the point where the Clerk of Parliament essentially opposed the amended version of the fast track bill because it was a type of private legislation. He was overruled by Jerry Brownlee, and since then the Labor Party has said that they've lost confidence in the Speaker, Jerry Brownlee. Which
That's quite interesting. It's very interesting that. Yeah. Like I say, I'm not. We do need several thousand houses in Papakura.
Yeah, I'd prefer several thousand houses in Mount Eden. And at the moment...
Not on Mount Eden, not on...
Well, I quite like them on Mount Eden.
Yeah.
For example, there's an absolutely crazy thing called a...
Has this got anything to do with Catherine's patch?
If I could get a word in. Yeah, it's like on that fast track bill, though, the list that they're worried about is a named list of people who have private interests that have been taken care of, basically, under the fast track legislation, but they're avoiding any normal democratic processes to have a look at what they're trying to do. And it's the same with the Climate Change Commission, in that you're replacing people who have at the forefront of their concerns are the public interests and environmental interests for the good of the entire public with people who are representing private vested interests, basically. And that is regulatory capture.
Oh, are you suggesting that there might be ethical problems with that, as the UK found with the VIP lane for people providing COVID assistance?
Yeah, I mean, this is the thing.
It's just a trend that's happening. It's accelerating big time at the moment, where you have a lot of industry, private interests that are getting into governance roles and sidelining the public interest. And that is something everybody should be concerned about.
But the public interest and their personal interest actually aligns. They align.
Yeah.
Well, we'll see. And certainly New Zealand doesn't have the same protections against the abuse of these connections between the private and public interest. Other countries, they have revolving door policies. They control and monitor donations to parties. They, for example, they don't allow someone to just stop being a minister and then becoming a lobbyist, which is what we've seen in a couple of cases recently. Chris Farfor goes from being a minister in cabinet to the head of the insurance council. I love Chris, he's a lovely man, and I'm not suggesting anything underhanded. But that would not be allowed in any other country. And also, we don't have an independent commission against corruption, as they do in Australia. And this is something we need to be careful about, because the big risk for any society is that its democracy becomes captured. And we like to think we're not captured, but we're becoming more and more captured by the day, I think.
But Bernard, we all went to the same schools. We've known each other since we were kids.
That's right.
You only see those frontline appointments as well, the ones that are kind of forward facing and that are obvious. What you don't see is all the conversations that are going on behind the scenes, and the way that they frame the questions that get asked and the policies that we start to design. Like, that's all got a whole lot of influence happening as well. That's pretty much invisible to us. We only see those really obvious frontline appointments. That's a small portion of what's actually going on behind the scenes, probably.
Yeah, and we're often seeing, for example, bits and pieces of legislation flying through, one of which accidentally hurt the interests of the organisation that wrote it for the government, and then when they realised, they had to say, "Oh, can you change it back again? Thanks." We saw that with the I think the gas industry, or one of those, where they accidentally wrote the wrong legislation for the government, and because things are being thrown through under urgency, the amount of legislation that's just not getting the scrutiny it should is extraordinary. Sorry, I'm ranting here, but I think this is something that's really important. The other thing, Catherine, this week that we saw was the government's second or final response to the Climate Commission's recommendations on emissions reductions to get to net zero. What did you think of what we heard from Simon Watts?
Yeah, I mean, and also the Climate Commission now has come out with a new recommendation for 2050, which is, so that's another thing again that the government will need to respond to down the line. But so we talked about the draft version a few months ago, and now they've put forward their final version. And, my biggest issue with it at the moment, I would say, is, I mean, apart from all of the obvious issues that we brought up during the draft submission process, now the changes that have gone through on this now, I would be wanting to ask some good questions about their modelling work, because there is some dodgy accounting going on in there. So it's things like the carbon capture and storage, which is now something, like it's quite a big percentage of the emissions reductions that they're planning through the 2025 to 2035 period. And they've put into the modelling that the gas field where they expect carbon capture and storage to be implemented will capture 100% of the gases. 100%. That hasn't happened anywhere. It's not possible. Like
100%. You mean 100% of the gases that it attempts to capture, or
yes,
100%
that it will capture 100% of the CO2 emissions from that gas plant and put them all underground.
Nice.
And
do they have a machine that can be in perpetual motion without using any energy as well?
Yeah. I mean, if you look at what has happened overseas with there's not a single carbon capture and storage site that is achieving its own targets. Usually their targets are, way below 80%. The average actually across globally where this is happening is between 10 and about 72% of stuff gets stored. And this is, like the Gorgon field in Australia has always missed its targets, and actually it is missing them by a greater and greater amount as time goes on, and also it ends up releasing into the atmosphere most of what it's captured at some point. So this sort of thing, like that's a ridiculous number to put into your modelling. If you're putting garbage into your model, you're going to get garbage out, and so I would say the chances of them actually achieving the numbers that they've put in are pretty low. The other one that was quite interesting, I think, was around agriculture. So carbon capture combined with agricultural pricing and technology are over 50% of the emissions reductions that they're planning for the years between 2025 and 2035. And most of that is based on technology that we've been dreaming about for a long time now, and it always gets pushed out further in terms of delivery. It's not ready yet. Like you wouldn't bet on it actually turning out. So why are we betting our numbers for meeting our targets on these unproven technologies that have failed to appear to date already? So that's two big parts of it that are really questionable. And then you get to now transport is our fastest growing emissions sector. And we have one policy in here for dealing with that, which is implementing EV charges. And the modelled impact on that, on transport sector emissions, is to reduce them by 0.016%. Like basically a big
It's a
donut,
triumph.
nothing. So we have no plan for the sector that has the fastest growing emissions in New Zealand.
Catherine,
And in fact, we are doing things to increase those emissions in that sector.
Catherine, did I also see a story this week that people's ordinary blokes' boats are a very significant contributor to carbon, and because they're not covered under transport, they're somehow covered under leisure, I guess, or something. They're actually a remarkable, people's fizz boats are a remarkably high factor. So we're going to be taking people's utes and their boats. It's going to be.
It's actually one of the things that the Climate Change Commission is now recommending for the future is that we need to start bringing in aviation and shipping, coastal stuff into our emissions targets. But so the Climate Change Commission has now come out with a new target saying we should be aiming for minus 20 million tonnes by 2050, so negative emissions in the long-lived gases. And that they're suggesting a 35 to 47% cut in methane by that. And those two things combined would actually make us actual net zero by 2050, as opposed to only net zero on less than half of our emissions.
Yes.
And so that would just catch up with everybody else. It's not,
It's essentially, you're right, Catherine, a completely risky strategy, not just, for meeting the law. This is the law of the land. We're going to get to net zero by this time.
Yeah.
But almost more importantly, this is a risk with our major trading relations. We have written into the EU and UK free trade agreements that we will abide by the Paris agreements. Now, the Paris Agreement targets are different from the ones talked about in this government climate response, because we're talking here about net zero and the New Zealand legislation. Paris is different. We can't take into account a lot of the sequestration we're using here. And the theory was we'd be buying credits overseas. We had, as we talked about last week, one minister already saying that's not going to happen, suggesting a reneging on that deal. I asked Simon Watts repeatedly about this yesterday, and he basically said that no decision's been made, we'll find a way. We're only 6 years away. The other thing that strikes me is that this is now a liability for the government. It's going to cost upwards of $16 billion at the prices forecast by the EU and the UK to buy these credits overseas if we get there. And that's $16 billion that should be written into the Crown accounts as a liability, which the government then will have to reduce, because it's all about debt reduction. And this is something I think where this will get a lot more traction, because it's too close. I mean, we're still hearing Simon Watts talk about, we've got time, this is 2050, this is 2035.
Yeah, well, my view is they're fiddling the numbers and the models to get the output that they want to make the target, and they're not refusing to own up to what's actually going to happen in terms of those offshore purchases. So, they really need to have their feet held to the flames over this, because we just want to know actually what is going on.
Flames?
Yeah.
I've got a few electric prodders.
I'm okay with that. Cattle prods.
Yeah.
Shall we move to Father Robert?
Thank you very much, Catherine. Cheers.
Thanks, Catherine.
Thank you.
And in fact, Robert, I just got a message in, because I'm the only one who still looks at the bloody YouTube messages, but somebody called Dallas Graham said, as soon as you popped up, said, I love Robert Patman. She only said love. Said love once. Love. And
that's very kind.
Someone also said, Artie Farty, who's very vocal, said, Catherine and Robert make a great tag team.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Robert, how are you?
I'm well, thank you. And how are you?
I warned everybody that because I discussed this at the very top of the hour, as it were, with Bernard. One of my Trump displacement activities is to read more books, and
Judgment at Tokyo.
Jesus Christ! Look,
That's a huge tome.
It's a very large tome, and it is absolutely superb. And what I keep thinking is, I must send this to Robert Patman. I could possibly do what I did with my former father-in-law once, which is reading. I was reading a Scott Turow book on the way to the airport, on the basis that I was supposed to give it to him, and I was reading it, hoping to, and I had to tear out the last 50 pages of the book and leave him with the other 450 pages, and then I forgot to send him the end. So he had to go to the Howick Library to get it. But I reckon this is so interesting, Robert, on the issues that you talk about often. But there is a sensible segue here, which is about collective activity, rules of war, treaties, and how these things emerge. And I think it is, because one of the things I was talking to Bernard about at the top was the Manchuria incident with the Japanese, where they moved into Manchuria, which was at that point a Chinese possession. And the reason they called it an incident was so that it wouldn't be covered by even the existing laws then on war. And I presume that's what Putin has been thinking about with his military operation, special military operation.
Presumably, but I think what you are alluding to is that we have seen a steady erosion of, if you like, the legacy of the Second World War, because I think those who, it's quite striking that we had innovations after the Second World War, new categories of crime, war, crimes against humanity, for example, in the Nuremberg trials and trials in Tokyo. And that was an attempt, I think, to bring in laws where none have existed before. And unfortunately, we seem to be in the 21st century moving away from that, and we seem to be creating a sort of new culture of impunity at the international level, which is unfortunate to say the least, particularly for the middle powers and smaller powers.
Yeah, and not to go on about my Trump derangement syndrome, but if you think of what Peter Hegseth, the potential new Secretary of State for Defense, said, and Defense Secretary, has done in the US, which is to defend accused war criminals in the US military. It's going to be open slather.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's going to be very interesting to see whether we see Pete Hegseth and also I always forget her first name, Gabbard.
Tulsi Gabbard.
Tulsi Gabbard, whether they can get through the nomination process, because at the moment, both of them seem to be encountering problems, not least from the Republican Party.
Yes, I think they're all going to encounter problems. Now, one of the problems that you and I talked a little bit about offline, and I think is particularly interesting should be particularly interesting to New Zealand, given the number of Syrian refugees that we've taken into the country, which would appear to be about 1,000, maybe 1,100 over the last 6 or 7 years, and we're still considering, I think, 100 applications from Syria right now.
Yep.
Is this remarkable performance by HTS, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which is an extraordinary coalition of rebel forces. I talked to MFAT this afternoon just to check, and because I could find on the lists of banned organisation that the Al-Nusra Front, which HTS emerged from, is a designated terrorist organisation in New Zealand, and they came back and said, actually, so is HTS, because it's on the UN list. But it is interesting to see, that's going to cause all sorts of issues, as Rory Stewart would say, about how we recognise what might be the new Syrian government.
Yes, I as I've said before, and I got hammered in another social media context for saying it, I think the West needs to show some. They shouldn't rush to judgment here. There's a lot at stake, and as we've discussed before, when you're living under a dictatorship, and as that showed in 2011, unarmed protest doesn't work because they're all shot. Mm-hmm. You have little option if you want to resist the regime but to use arms. What is interesting is that HTS, under the leadership of Mohammed al-Jilani, has been very measured. It's been inclusive. It's put together a coalition with groups that were linked to the United States, Free Syrian groups. And in addition, they've released all political prisoners, including those who may be opposed to their own interests. And in addition, they've signaled they want to move to a market economy. The reason I mention this is I think it would be very wise for the United States and if the United States doesn't do it because of its close alliance with Israel, I think the other Western liberal countries should seriously consider it, which is incentivize the democratic transition which HTS said they want.
Yeah.
And I have no doubt there'll be plenty of opposition to a democratic transition in Syria, not least from many of its Arab neighbours.
Yeah.
It would go down like a lead balloon in Saudi Arabia if Syria emerged from this horrendous period in its history under the Assad leadership, repression actually, and moved, perhaps falteringly, towards a more representative system, which was inclusive of all the different ethnic groups. I think that would be a very good thing for the region in the long run. But I do think if we write them off as a bunch of terrorists before they've had a chance to walk the talk, that would be strategic folly. And I'm very concerned about the way Israel has responded, extending the amount of land that they have access to in Syria, and also something like, is it 500 or 400 bombing runs? And they said they've knocked out 80% of Syria's military capabilities, but that's a presumption that those military capabilities would be used against Israel.
So, Robert, you and I seldom disagree in the sense that, I just bow to your greater wisdom and knowledge and then insert the odd, smirk and piece of bollocks in the middle. I disagree with you about this, and it's because it seems to me, as a non-expert, and people who watch us regularly will know that I'm, often heavily critical or deeply questioning of Benjamin Netanyahu. But this seems to me to be strategically, tactically, and intelligently an incredibly smart thing for Israel to do, to try to put out of commission and out of the hands of this new regime all of the naval ships, the chemical weapons dumps, and everything that are there for had been set up by Assad and also by Iran. There is no longer a kind of superhighway running across from Iran across Syria into Lebanon. And as much as we may disapprove of what Israel does in Gaza or Lebanon, except that isn't it? Sorry, go ahead.
No, I'm just saying I understand where you're coming from, but I think the problem is on several fronts. Firstly, Netanyahu's Israel is reserving the right to breach international law in the way it's doing, taking out other people's military capabilities on suspicion they might be used by a regime which has pledged itself to a democratic transition. That seems to be basically making the rules as you go along.
Absolutely.
But the second point is, does it make Israel more secure? Does it actually mean they're bombing and presumably killing some innocent Syrians in the process, Israel actually becomes more secure? And I'm actually doubtful Israel is more secure after its activities in Gaza and Lebanon and now Syria than it was before the 7th of October. You see, there's no military solution to a political problem.
Sure. But Robert, let me just hold, and I know the audience will go wild because they love you. But so we talked about in previous podcasts, the invasion of Lebanon is an extraordinary thing. It's a breach of international law, blah, blah, blah. However, could HTS, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, have taken charge in Syria without the destruction of Hezbollah in Lebanon?
Let's be quite clear. HTS retained a foothold in Syria even when Assad was fully in charge, as much as in charge as he was. The other thing was, Assad, it's very important to have a historical perspective. Assad was on the ropes in 2011. He was saved by, Hezbollah, Iran,
and Russia.
I think a misjudgment by Mr. Obama, and also Putin. It was Putin's intervention between September 2015, March 2016, the relentless bombing of Aleppo, which has been repeated, of course, in Ukraine, hitting civilian targets, etc. The regime was never strong. It was always vulnerable. And yes, I think the unintended consequence of weakening Hezbollah, Israel didn't weaken Hezbollah, nor did Joe Biden, as a master plan to unseat Assad. And you have to weigh that against the costs of the policy.
No, but it is. I mean, you would agree that the destruction of Hezbollah has made.
Is it destroyed? No, it's weakened. It's degraded.
Yeah.
Has it got animus towards Israel more so than before? Will it regroup and rebuild and threaten Israel in the future? I'm afraid so. Hezbollah's weakening, Iran's weakening. Iran, interestingly, has preferred to act through its proxies rather than confront Israel directly, mostly. A big blow for Putin in Syria, no doubt about that.
Bernard, you want to talk to Robert about that?
Yeah, Robert, I'm curious as to why Putin and Iran didn't intervene again. Is that because they couldn't, or because that they didn't want to?
I think, we know that Putin did, the first call from help for Assad about 10 days ago, he went to Moscow. The Russian bases the planes did bomb the rebel positions, HTS I should say, and but they didn't put any ground troops behind the Syrian army. The Syrian army was always weak. At their best, they were about 17,000 strong in a big country.
Really? Wow.
Yeah.
I didn't know it was
because
that little.
if you look at it in ethnicity terms,
yeah,
the Alawites that support which the regime, that's where its core constituency is. The Assad regime's core constituency was Alawites. They were about 17 to 18% of the population. So, in a sense, the regime had to survive through foreign support. But there's no doubt about it. Israel's degrading of Hezbollah, Iran, and Hamas has contributed to a situation where Iran and Russia have not been able to respond in the way they could in 2011 and in 2016.
Yeah. Did you see, Robert?
Russia's taking enormous casualties. People don't talk about this. They're edging forward in the east, but they're doing so a casualty rate about 1,500 a day. So how long that can go on, we don't know. But this is a big blow. And if I was Putin, I'd be very concerned because, let's be quite clear, even in authoritarian regimes, there is a day of reckoning. There's always someone who thinks they can do a better job than the boss, and there may be the person who's very close to Putin. And let's look at this. Russia has expended billions in Syria, and what's it got out of it? Well, it had to abandon jets, which, interestingly, HTS said they would not destroy and that Russia could reclaim them peacefully. But a lot of military equipment. And they pumped in billions. They've lost significant numbers of military personnel in Syria over the years. And you can just imagine the sort of if there's a discussion, how the Kremlin sees this. Some people close to Putin, they'll say, well, that did us a lot of good, didn't it?
But don't you think, Robert, that one of the reactions may be to double down on Ukraine, especially given that the Washington Post has
that'll be Putin's
today,
reaction. But what about other people? They'll say, well, we've given it our best shot in Ukraine and we've lost Syria in the process. The only strategic base we had in the Middle East. Now, I have no doubt you're right, Peter. They will double down and they'll do their best. But the Russian economy is showing real signs of strain. The military-industrial complex in Russia has been boosted by the invasion of Ukraine, but it seems to be eating the rest of the economy in the process.
Yeah. So, and Robert, though, did you see the story in the Washington Post today that Ukraine has sent several hundred drones to help the HTS? I mean, that's
I think that's very plausible. I think Zelensky, sometimes presented as a buffoon, but he strikes me as a real infighter who will take every opportunity to weaken Putin, every opportunity he can. And so it doesn't surprise me at all.
Bernard?
Yes, I'm curious now what happens in Ukraine. We've got this period of a couple of weeks, 3 or 4 weeks before Trump gets in. Everyone's sort of circling and waiting and preparing. What should we watch out for, Robert? Is it a matter of Trump gets in January 10 or whatever it is and says stop now and everyone stops, or what?
I don't think so, because Turkey said something very significant before it gave the green light and the key strategic support for HTS to basically overthrow Assad. And they said they would not tolerate an outcome. Erdogan was very, very clear. He said, we will not accept an outcome in Ukraine which fails to honour Ukrainians' territorial integrity. In other words, he doesn't accept a land for peace deal. Now, this guy's got clout.
Yes, he does. Yeah.
And he in Turkey has been very influential in what's happened in
Doesn't it seem a million years
Syria.
ago that you had Abramovich running potential peace talks in Turkey about bringing a peace to Ukraine? And also, if you think about the impact on Russia of the Israeli attacks on Iran a couple of months ago, does not make you very confident about the S-300 and S-400 weapons that Turkey bought. Turkey, as a NATO nation, bought from Russia. There's some very interesting bedfellows going on here, isn't there?
Yeah, I think what we can say, though, is Turkey has reasserted itself both in the Middle East and also to some degree in Europe.
And Robert, what do you make of I think the US has 5 bases and 930 or so military people based in Syria at the moment, and yet Donald Trump put out that rather ludicrous comment, I think, while he was at Notre Dame, despite going to Notre Dame apparently symbolically wearing a suit and a tie in the colours of Ukraine. The US can't ignore what's going on in Syria, can it?
No, it's been a story of the last 2 decades since Mr. Bush got America overextended in the Middle East. Subsequent presidents from Obama onwards have tried to distance themselves from the events of the Middle East, but always get sucked in again. And I wouldn't mind predicting that could happen with Trump. Mr. Trump rails about the deep state and also about how people haven't always carried out his orders when he was president previously. I think he will find, as the most powerful country in the world, it's very difficult to keep out of the Middle East.
Yeah.
And I'm not convinced that he will be able to extricate himself. His position is that we should have nothing to do with Syria and only back our friends like Israel.
Bernard.
Yeah.
Yes, Robert, just one more thing I think is worth putting on people's radars for the next month or two overseas, and that's the German elections. So we've had the breakup of the coalition, and now we've got elections scheduled for February. And there are parts of Germany where, a very far right a party could, win. And it strikes me that Angela Merkel, who was seen as this, great leader, is even she is acknowledging that they were too tough in the last decade or so with their investment drought and their fiscal break, and it's had consequences in that there's a lot of very unhappy people in Germany. Is that the sort of wild card that could upset things in Europe if Germany suddenly is led by a bunch of people who are quite friendly to Russia and probably funded by Russia?
The Alternative for Deutschland are very friendly. Yeah. They are neo-Nazis and they've been partly financed by Putin. So, and their youth get trained in Moscow. So I think that Mr. Putin's got a huge stake in this. Mr. Putin has to hope that he can survive to see what happens. But it seems to me, because, I always say, the thing about authoritarian regimes, when someone decides to move, either within the regime or outside it, you never know in advance. So you wake up one day and you find out, as we did with Prigozhin's attempt, it suddenly came out of the blue.
Yeah.
And I wouldn't rule out something happening in Moscow between now and then. Having said that, yes, it's very worrying, Bernard. The rise of the right, and the Merkel's decision to admit 1 million Syrians into Germany has been one of the things cited. Now, AfD is saying that we've done our duty by the Syrians and they should go back home. I'm going to be in Germany in January for a while, so it'll be interesting to see that situation. I was actually quite impressed when I was last in Germany how well so many Syrians had integrated into Germany, and of course there are many young people. That's the thing, is the bulk of the Syrians who came in were medical, well, not just medical, but they were professional people, many of them quite young, and have integrated nicely into German society. So I'm not sure how far AfD can play that. I'm also rather fascinated by Merz, who's the Christian Democratic leader. He seems to be much more matter-of-fact about the Ukraine war than Olaf Scholz was. Scholz seemed to be a weak leader to me. He seemed to measure military support out. Germany, to be fair to Scholz, Germany is still the second biggest provider of military support for Ukraine. But you're quite right, Germany and France are both experiencing a fair degree of domestic turmoil at the moment, and they're key players in the EU.
Yeah, but Emmanuel Macron does look bloody good in a high-necked polo neck.
And you've got to admire the Notre Dame rebuild. That is an amazing thing. Absolutely.
I know this is so ridiculous, but I just don't care. I mean, I cared about it catching fire, but I don't care about it being repaired by a bunch of French luxury goods billionaires.
We have a cathedral that is still in ruins in our second biggest city, 13 years after it crumbled.
Yeah, but we also don't have Bernard Arnault and the guy who owns Richemont to build it. And also, can I just point out, Bernard, it's a bloody piece of Victorian pastiche. When we do let's do an architecture podcast next year, and I will advocate the demolition of most of Auckland,
right? Good,
and certainly most of Wellington, which is probably going to be demolished anyway.
Good.
Robert, you're fabulous, and I'm sorry about disagreeing with you on Netanyahu, because I just
you may be right and I may be wrong. That's the name of the game.
I think it is an extraordinary exercise in realpolitik to go and clean out those military positions, to essentially say, as Trump has already said, that the Golan Heights is going to stay there forever.
Yeah, but it's an interesting... that's where I become skeptical, Peter, because throughout my lifetime, we've seen, and it happened in the United States, it's happened in other countries, when countries have a very strong military capability at their fingertips, and Israel does compared to its neighbours, there's a tendency to see every problem as a nail that has to be hit on the head.
With an extremely
powerful
my
feeling
hammer.
is that there's going to be a backlash, and basically we are still no closer to dealing with some of the root causes which driving instability in that region. You can't just suppress them through military force. Yeah. And so I think that on the face of it, it looks like a very good surgical piece of work that gives Israel some short-term peace of mind. I'm not sure whether it will give it more peace of mind in the long run, but we'll see.
Well put. I'm getting shat on already by being in Auckland and suggesting that half of Wellington deserves to fall into the sea.
That's all right. Hoon can slide in as well.
Well, it already has. Half of it has. Yeah.
So
thank you,
Robert.
See
thank you
next week.
We're looking forward to your views on the year that was next week, and also if you are in Germany on January the 23rd, that's when we restart the Hoon. And,
yes.
I actually, unfortunately, leaving.
Baby.
I'll be in the Netherlands.
Well, that's the same time zone. We'll be there.
It's good.
Part of my family in the Netherlands. So I'm speaking in Germany, 3 universities.
Are you going on some sort of outrageous, buddy, taxpayer-funded sabbatical?
No.
It's
I've used money that I got an award, the Critic and Conscience Society Award.
Oh, great! Yeah.
And I've invested part of that to speak about a book I'm working
Brilliant.
on. So.
Fantastic.
Actually, next week we'll talk more about books, because you have a book you want to talk about.
Oh yes, very much.
And
so.
I will try not to just tear off the last 50 pages of this and send,
because I'm going to read that
890. But we'll talk next week about books. We'll talk next week with Helen and Josie Pagani. And although I've had some very mean notes about Josie in the thing, which I'm just going to ignore, and some mean notes about me. So
that's out of the edit. Thank you very much, and thank you very much, Robert. We appreciate it.
Thank you, Bernard. Thank you, Peter. Cheers.
Okay, Peter, I wanted to just finish up today because I'm really looking forward to next week.
Is this your soliloquy? Are you going to start with a soliloquy, or are we going to talk about media?
Oh yes, let's talk about media first because there's a big report out today from the AUT's Media Centre. Maria Mililati and co. About media ownership. What did you think of it?
So media ownership in New Zealand is contracting because media is contracting. So media is becoming essentially stuff owned by Sinead Boucher directly as a private company and a listed company, NZME, and the rest of it is fucked. Look, the rest of it is not in great shape. Sorry, Simon, I just need to get... The rest of it is not in great shape.
Yes, that's true. We still have the spin-off, although obviously it has asked for some help, and it's had quite a good response to its plea for new supporters. Newsroom is still there, as is interest. But you're right, in terms of mainstream, largely accessible, watched by hundreds of thousands a night, we're down to One News, RNZ, which has done a great job with its website this year.
It has.
And we've got One News, RNZ, stuff to an extent, but I have to say I'd be surprised if that TV operation lasted more than a couple of years. And that's it. And we're seeing some of these provincial newspapers being shut down, 14 from NZME in the last couple of weeks. And it wouldn't surprise me if more of those go from stuff.
Yeah.
And the current government is not keen on any sort of public interest journalism fund, and it's interesting some of the projects that have been awarded public funds from New Zealand On Air are not the ones that were awarded public funds in the past, and you sense that again as the government keeps pursuing its austerity, get the government out of the economy side of things, it's not going to get much help from the government. Doesn't look like it's going to get much help from Google or anyone else.
Yeah, it's not. We can't ask one business to subsidise another, not to sound too much like David Seymour.
Well, governments invest in all sorts of infrastructure, and then private companies jump in and make profits by using that infrastructure.
See earlier conversation about Winton. Yeah.
Yeah. Yes, and all of the products of Google and Amazon and Microsoft and Meta are delivered on a network that was built by the taxpayers of New Zealand.
Bernard, one of the things that let me just make 2 points on what you've said, and it fits with the, because I want to tell you about a little epiphany I had the other day. But on the NZME, we talked briefly last week, I think it was, about the 14 local newspapers being shut down around the country. It is extraordinary to me that they would shut them down and then start conversations with the editors and locals about whether they could be turned into philanthropic or locally supported organisations. I think that was really ruthless and unpleasant. And I think we need to talk about philanthropy in New Zealand journalism. But can all of the existing New Zealand news companies actually say that their owned local news services, whether it's Western Leader where I started, or the Rodney and Weekend Times, or the Franklin, whatever it's called, are serving those audiences and serving the advertisers in those places? And I suspect some of this is self-inflicted. Now, the other one, Bernard, that I wanted to say, it's not my epiphany, my soliloquy, but a tiny epiphany. I was watching TVNZ Plus the other day, on my postage stamp size television, and I thought, hang on a minute, this is an excellent streaming service, but why is it publicly owned? And the only thing now, I believe, that makes it valid to have that service publicly owned, or anything from TVNZ, is news. So they better be bloody careful about continuing to shrink their news, because news is what gives them their social license. Because New Zealand On Air can fund drama and sport and whatever it wishes to commercial broadcasters and so on. I think I looked at TVNZ Plus and I thought, hang on a minute, this is losing its social license to exist as a public funded broadcaster.
Yeah, and we've all learned too that when we outsource everything and go for the most efficient option, that reduces our resilience.
Yes.
And one of the interesting things about, again, the Cyclone Gabrielle at the beginning of last year was the extraordinarily useful role of boring old radio in communicating with
radio
people.
is the most one we know from podcasting. I mean, apparently, Bernard, some podcasts are really, really, really successful. And what are podcasts? A different form of radio.
Yes, but
Chewing gum for the ears.
Yeah, well, what we found is that internet delivered content stopped the moment the power stopped, the moment the telco networks go down, the moment the mobile networks batteries run out, and radio, wind-up radios or a bit of a battery,
as opposed to wind-up podcasts like ours.
That's right. They're bloody useful, and so is television. Which as long as you've got some power, you can communicate with people.
Okay, prediction: within 3 years, we won't have linear television in New Zealand.
Not at all.
Not at all. 5 years. All right, 5 years.
Yeah, I mean, obviously we've gotten rid of the analog version of television. We're now digital, but I'd be surprised. It's still, what is certainly a big chunk of the population. It's a major part of their day.
Yeah. Old people, and the good thing is old people vote.
Yeah. So,
Bernard, if you wanted to do a soliloquy, what's it about?
It's about property. No, actually, it's about ferries. This week has been a huge week for the government in that it failed to deliver on a decision that was useful on the ferries. The entire freight industry, logistics industry, the two ports in Picton and Wellington have no idea what they need to invest or think about for the next decade. We're not going to know, at least until March, when the tender documents go out. We're not going to get a new ferry, until 2029 at the earliest. We still have to wait for decisions by the Marlborough and Wellington regional councils about what they invest in and whether they can and whether they borrow. We've essentially punted off into the future of our entire logistics system in New Zealand, the connections between our two main islands. We've also put in doubt our entire climate emissions reduction strategy, because at the moment, if we get only rail compatible ferries, the ones where you have to take the containers off the train and then stick it onto a truck and then drive the truck on the ferry, that's a half an hour at either end. That's incredibly inefficient. It means there'll be an extra 6,000 trucks on the roads. And it means our hopes of significantly reducing emissions from our freight network are dashed, all because the government is in a knee-jerk way responding to a crisis. There is no crisis with our budget situation. And they're essentially saying that there's an election in a year and a half's time, and whatever happens after that, we don't care. And it's awful. And I think the public is starting to see this is not good. And we've seen that in the last couple of weeks, the polls that we do get, and there aren't as many as there used to be. Although, interestingly, stuff has come out with one more.
The Taxpayers Union does them, and the Free Speech Union does them.
And One News, and Stuff actually has added a poll, which is great, Freshwater Research. And those polls are showing the gap is closing, that Christopher Luxon's personal popularity is now in one of the polls behind Christopher Luxon. And also that we're starting to see the strains within the coalition come out. For the first time this week, I thought we saw in public Winston Peters and David Seymour start to get grumpy.
Yes, wasn't that entertaining? I was just looking up the UFC, the Ultimate Fight Club, and thinking that which one of them is Israel Adesanya, because I think that I absolutely hate the UFC and the entire concept, but I certainly would pay money to go and watch Winston and David cage fight, particularly if they were covered in mud or oil or something disgusting, but not naked, please.
No, I think we went just a little bit far with that idea. Would I? I would. It would
but
be
this
quite.
This is going to be a mega tiff, though, isn't it?
Yeah, because this is something Winston cares about. He loves ferries. He loves rail, and now he's got his hands back on it. And remember, he was involved in that cabinet that signed up to IREX to start with.
Yeah.
So, and David Seymour sees the privatisation of the Inter-Islander as a major victory for ACT. This is transforming a chunk of the economy from being publicly owned to privately owned. That's what he's all about.
Okay, so let me ask you this, because Patrick Smelly had a sleepover at my place last night, and we were talking about this morning. And I don't want anybody to be repelled by that, by the way. It's not, no, he did have his own room. But Alan Gibbs, you've got the Atlas Network, created in a sense by Alan Gibbs and his daughter, the ACT Party created by Alan Gibbs. And don't we owe Alan Gibbs a debt of not gratitude, the opposite of gratitude, for completely buggering Kiwi Rail?
Absolutely, and some of his friends at Fay Rich White and the rest. Interestingly though, Richard Prebble, one of the great founders of ACT and very involved, he was a director on the Main Freight Board, has come out and said he thinks there should be rail-enabled ferries, and he's not necessarily a fan of this idea that David Seymour has. And I think this is going to, it's a bad look for the government. They cancelled something in a mad, knee-jerk way. It's cost at least a couple of $100 million in break fees. It's pissed off the South Koreans. Luckily for us, the South Koreans are busily being pissed off with the president right now. But what building yard in the world would say yes to an offer from the New Zealand government?
I'm absolutely sure that there's a Russian one that would be quite happy to do it. But Bernard, just do we? We've had Nicola Willis on before she was a minister. Was that a moronic decision to take, and was it hers almost entirely on her own?
I think it was a reckless and rash thing to do. And there have been other reckless and rash decisions made simply in a desperate attempt to try to get back to surplus as fast as possible when there was no crisis. We do not have a debt crisis. There was a bond issue today by the government. It raised $500 million, huge amounts of bids, managed to get it through for 4-point-something%. We do not have a debt crisis. We should use the Crown's balance sheet to borrow to invest in our future. This is myopic, short-term and panicked thinking, which is not what we want from our leaders. And it ignores our future and the climate we live in.
Yep.
It ignores the fact we are going to have population growth, and there will be climate events, and there will be quakes in Picton and Wellington. That's why you invest in new infrastructure. And if you spend $3 billion in 2024, when those ports are still there in 75 years, $3 billion will be nothing. And we will have
exactly.
underwritten the future.
I was thinking that absolutely. I mean, also presumably it was a moderately well thought out thing. Shall I give you the
skateboarding dog?
Skateboarding dog.
Yes,
it's a bit of a dad joke, but it was put out by Garry Kasparov, the famous Russian chess player, and he fed this joke from another person. Assad is a trained ophthalmologist, and yet he didn't see this coming.
Good joke. Good dad joke. That's on that note.
Yes.
Thank you very much, everyone. It's been a lovely show. Thank you, Peter. And we look forward to our final show of 2024. Next Thursday at 5 o'clock, we'll have a couple of special guests on, Helen Clark, Josie Pagani, and
the estimable Sir Robert,
Sir Robert.
I'm expecting it any minute, but Professor Robert Patman.
Absolutely. See you later, everyone. We'll catch you next week. Bye-bye. Alrighty. Phew. Well done, Peter. That was great.